The vigil of the family, a king, princes and a princess, stand guard as the public pays its respects. As a nation, joined by presidents, prime ministers, monarchs and dignitaries, prepares to lay Queen Elizabeth to rest, and the queue stretches longer and longer. We ask whether the country has changed, making it a more united kingdom, and how we are now seen in the world. As one First Minister says the new king is concerned about how households will manage this winter, will we continue to hear more about big issues from the new monarch? Also tonight, in a week that may have changed the direction of the biggest war in Europe since World War II, after battlefield success for Ukraine, are there signs that President Putin, at least to non-Western nations, is starting to change his tone? Now, there's a lot going on in the world, in the currency markets, diplomacy and household finances. But the world's attention is on the UK until Monday for an obvious reason. It's been another day of remarkable public displays, of sadness at the loss of Queen Elizabeth and thanks for her service. People are now waiting up to 24 hours to pay their respects in person at Westminster Hall, even though the queue reached capacity and had to temporarily shut during the day. At 2 a.m, at the back of it, the beck of the queue, the former England captain David Beckham spending 12 hours in line. Tonight and tomorrow, the vigil of the princes, with the Dukes of York and Sussex finally allowed to wear military dress. World leaders, including Presidents Biden and Macron, are arriving shortly, with New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern explaining why.
She stood with us during times of great sadness and tragedy, and stood alongside us in times of joy and celebration. She was a constant in all of our lives.
In Surrey, the Commonwealth servicemen that the late Queen was so keen to be represented in her funeral were practising their participation. And King Charles visited Wales for the first time as monarch, completing a 4-nation tour. After this, the Welsh First Minister Mark Drakeford said the King had expressed concern about how people would get through the winter. Later in the programme, we'll hear from someone who's been talking to people up and down that queue and discussing where this momentous week leaves Britain, our sense of self and our place in the world. But first, it's been a week of upheaval in Ukraine and a very bad week for Vladimir Putin. In newly liberated Izium, the Ukraine government has unearthed hundreds of dead bodies, some of which they say show signs of torture condemned by French President Macron as atrocities. Whether Kyiv's reclaiming of most of Kharkiv province is just the start of a rout remains unclear, but by the end of the week, Putin was obliged to tell the leaders of both China and India that he understood their concerns about his war. Is this just a change of tone or a fundamental turning point? Here's our chief correspondent, David Grossman.
As the tide of Russian forces has been pushed back, this is what's left behind: hundreds of graves. Ukrainian authorities in Izium exhuming bodies. They say perhaps as many as 400 on this site alone. Exactly who they are or how they died is so far unclear. However, the Kharkiv regional government says they're certain they found evidence of war crimes.
There
are many children. There are bodies with hands tied on their backs. Each of these facts will be investigated, and they will get a legal review. Still, all of this can only testify that the world has to acknowledge that this is a genocide of the Ukrainian people.
The map of ground retaken by Ukrainian forces over the last week makes startling viewing. Some military experts believe Russia will struggle to adjust to what's just happened.
For a Russian priority, they need to reset a defensive line on ground that they can actually defend. And that's critical because Ukraine has the momentum, it has the initiative, and actually it has the operational art that we've seen from this very daring operation in the east that probably has been far more successful than the Ukrainians even thought. But what is clear, and it has been clear since the start of the operation in February, is that Russia just does not have the troops to try and achieve what it wants to militarily in Ukraine.
Vladimir Putin was in Uzbekistan yesterday, meeting some of the few world leaders who'll still take his calls. The Chinese president may have greeted his Russian counterpart as "my dear old friend," but this is not a relationship of equals, and China may be having doubts.
I don't think it's entirely clear to them whether to have the Russians as a friend is still all that useful to them. It seemed quite obvious from Putin's opening remarks that he was talking from below to a superior. We know you have questions and concerns. That's not how friends speak who are equal.
As the scale of Russian losses intensifies, there isn't a ready pool of quality equipment or recruits with which to replace them. These pictures, verified by the BBC, show the leader of Russia's Wagner group of mercenaries addressing civilian prisoners in Russia. In return for 6 months military service, he tells them they'll be set free.
The biggest sin is desertion. No one backs down, no one retreats, no one surrenders.
This does not suggest a military with many options, at least not good ones.
It shows the desperation that Russian forces are under just to increase the personnel that can fight in Ukraine, which is okay on the defensive side, but the offensive requirements and training requirements are completely different. So they're still going to be in a very difficult position if they want to go on the offensive and try and take back territory that they've lost.
Никаких изменений нет.
Mr. Putin told reporters today that his military plan in Ukraine is working, but warned that the conflict could, quote, get more serious.
The
Kyiv authorities have announced that they have started an active counter-offensive operation. We'll see how it goes and how it ends.
But what keeps Western leaders up at night is what Vladimir Putin might do if he feels that the Ukraine fight is becoming hopeless. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has triggered consequences well beyond the battlefield, from energy to geopolitics. How Russia, how the West, how the world emerges from this, and how soon, is still shrouded in gunsmoke.
David Grossman there. I'm joined now by Ukrainian Member of Parliament Maria Yanova and the Chair of International Law and International Constitutional Studies at the University of Cambridge, Professor Mark Weller. Thanks for joining us. Let me start with you, Maria Yanova. Has this week sort of changed the fate of your nation? Do you now feel that you can reclaim all of the lost territory?
First of all, warm condolences of you're such a huge loss, because the Queen was an example of dignity and, of course, of true service to her country. And regarding your question, I'd like to say that we are approaching the victory with military success in hand. And our brave armed forces of Ukraine and our heroic people, they're just writing today the history of a free world. And of course, news from Izum just making world again shocked by such war crimes which Russia provided in Ukraine. Because it's not only 100, it's already 500 civilians only in Izum. And we can only imagine, really, what they have done in Kharkiv Oblast. And unfortunately, we can only imagine what we will see when we will liberate our other regions and territories. But my message is that the world has also to understand and realize that we need really more weapons for Ukraine, because the shorter path to peace, and we really rely on more investments from free world, because it's an impact of your security and security of NATO and security of free world. I would like to say that, of course, Putin will say anything he wants, but as we see also from Izum, this country is providing a genocide in Ukraine, and this country is financing terrorism in our country, because they have organized tortured premises. I mean, we see how these people shot into their hands and how they just killed by the families, because also including children, they our authorities has found in this massive graves.
Let me thank you for that and laying that out. That's shocking what seems to have happened in Izium. Let me bring in Mark Weller. Does Ukraine's success on the battlefield, do you think it gets us closer to this kind of war ending?
Well, we had all expected that there would be a September offensive, as it were. Nobody quite thought it would be as instantly successful as it seems to have been thus far. And the question is how Mr. Putin will now respond. Previously, the plan seems to have been to have a war of the city, of attrition, to try and wear down the people of Ukraine over the winter by attacking infrastructure and civilian targets with increasing power. He now may have to consider whether there should be more combatants introduced, i.e. the possibility of a wider mobilization, possibly use of other types of weapons, which obviously I think many international politicians, even those slightly friendly to him, will try to dissuade him.
Let's spell it out. So you're talking weapons of mass destruction, tactical nuclear weapons?
It could be chemical weapons, it could be a vast escalation of attacks against cities with conventional weapons, or possibly even nuclear, which in former Soviet doctrine, now Russian doctrine, is not seen as something quite as extraordinary as we would think.
So it's in the doctrine, this is the key thing, and that's published. And so I guess the question, are you expressing that fear analytically, or are you worried, or are you suggesting that the West should sort of factor that in their calculations and maybe persuade Ukraine to show some restraint if it proves too successful? Is that what you're suggesting?
No, we cannot invite the Ukrainians to cease from defending their own countries and essentially their own lives. But I think we also have to try and think about how all of this will end, to encourage all of the sides to think of some way. Even if Ukraine wins, Russia will remain its immediate neighbor. There will have to be some sort of arrangements. What happens to the Russian speakers who live in territories that will be recaptured? And all of this could be thought about a little bit in advance.
Let me put some of that to Maria. I mean, we are hearing some voices after your spectacular success sort of wondering, could this yield some shock tactics from the Kremlin, and maybe there should be some restraint? What do you make of that argument?
First of all, I'd like to say that our Ukrainian army has proved that we can do it, and we can kick out so-called the second army of the world. The price which Ukraine pays is really very high, but we understand that we will fight till the end, because Russians are killing us only because that we are Ukrainians. And Izium situation has showed that they were killing civilians just because they're Ukrainians. And that is why temporary, yes, we are counter-offensive attacks were successful, but we need more weapons to liberate more territory. And do not afraid of Putin's blackmailing, because of course he is threatening the world, as my colleague guest has mentioned, with their nuclear weapons, global hunger, freezing winter. We as Ukrainians, we only understand that Russia has to be deputinized, demilitarized, and also more weapon to Ukraine and more sanctions to Russia. Because, more investments to Russia, it's more killings in Ukraine. And that is why we recall all our friends and leaders of the free world, don't look on the truth with the closed eyes, and really to have very brave and courage actions, cut off dependency on Russia energy, sanction on nuclear energy, and sorry, not all the banks are turned off from.
So more can be done. Let me just put a last question back to Mark. How encouraging is the noises we're hearing out of India and China from your perspective?
I think that is absolutely vital, and everybody had hoped that China in particular would at some stage realize that it has to jump the right way if it wants to play a leading role in the world. And that may hopefully be now commencing. But the big lesson here is that the West alone no longer runs the world through financial institutions, the UN and other bodies. There are many free-floating states that arrange their affairs with others according to their immediate interests, and we've seen that in this case.
We must leave that there. Thank you very much, Professor Mark Weller, and also Maria Ayanova in Kyiv. Thank you very much for joining us there. Now, the queue for seeing Her Majesty lying in state was at capacity for hours today, and even at this late hour, the wait is put at 20 hours. There are so many queuing that they've developed a queue for the queue and then another one even to join that. These are live shots right now, just outside Parliament at nearly 11 o'clock at night on a Friday. There are some concerns that not everyone in it will eventually make it for that brief moment of solemnity in Westminster Hall, and ambulance services have treated 435 queuers too. But the tens of thousands waiting patiently to pay their respects have given us a window onto the country in 2022, including a teary David Beckham.
We all want to be here together. We all want to experience something where we celebrate the amazing life of our Queen. And I think, you know, something like this today is meant to be shared together. So, you know, the fact that we've been here, we're eating Pringles, we're eating sherbet lemons, you know, we're eating sandwiches, having coffee, so donuts as well.
Madam, you didn't think that you'd be in the queue with David Beckham, did you?
No, I didn't, but big respect to him. He's stood with us and he's paid his respects how he wants to. Yeah. And I think that's amazing. And it's just been really good.
And how long have you been in the queue, David?
I think we all got here, 12 hours.
Right.
I'm now joined in the studio by Lucy Bannerman, news reporter and feature writer for The Times, who's been interviewing people in the queue to see the Queen lying in state at Westminster Hall. Lovely piece you wrote today. You know, give us a sense of what you have seen.
The queue. Well, the queue's a thing of wonder, isn't it?
Sentient, it seems, from your description.
It feels like the queue that Britons have been training for all our lives. And it's almost taken on this life of its own. It's become this gargantuan human snake, sort of engorged on bouquets of flowers and a million mini Paddington bears. And I've spoken to people who had no intention of joining the queue. They just got sucked into it, you know, such is the seductiveness of the queue. You know, I spoke to one 25-year-old woman who said that she spent the first hour in denial that she was actually in the queue. And then the hours went by, and then before she knew it, 9 hours later, she's there in the silence of Westminster Hall, looking up at the coffin at 3 a.m. and having a very humbling and moving experience.
And generally, these are royalists, you know, maybe the entire subscription of Majesty magazine in there or not? Is it a more representative cross-section of British society?
Yeah, these are not the die-hard royalists who will appear for the christening of a royal baby that many of us don't know the name of. You know, these are Queen fans, and it's a much broader church. And it's been very interesting just watching the public reaction. And for many people, it's just become a shared collective experience, and it's become a rites of passage just to do this and pay their respects.
Well, it sounds almost religious, but let's widen this out a bit, building on that discussion with a look at what all this means. It's been quite a week of bereavement, ceremony, constitutional procedure, public outpourings and celebration of a life of service and, of course, the interest of the rest of the world.
Three cheers for His Majesty the King. Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray!
the sights and sounds of the past week. Now, Lucy's still with us, but we're now joined by the esteemed historian David Olusoga and the journalist Simon Jenkins to discuss all of this. It's very interesting because we've had this confirmed, this notion that the King raised his concern about cost of living and what families do over the winter. What do you make of that, Simon Jenkins? Are you surprised? I thought I heard him last week saying he was going to sort of, leave his issues behind. Maybe this is just, perfectly natural thing for a king to show concern about.
I would have thought it was.
Yeah.
It'd be very odd not to express concern. It's been a very remarkable week. I mean, really, it has, for the first time in many months, if not years, been a week in which the country's come together. It's been calm. It's been united. I'm a bit of a sceptic about monarchy sometimes, but this has been monarchy at its best, I have to say. It's performed exactly as it should. The idea that the king should express concern about something that everyone else is concerned about is hardly surprising. I really think they've come through this very well. I don't think monarchy is about power. It's about influence. It's about example. It's about dignity. It's about nationalism. I think it's enhanced itself very considerably. I imagine when the first polls come out, we'll learn that in this particular period. So it's really good news. We haven't had much good news in this country for quite some time.
Well, we'll come on to that. David Olusoga, thanks for joining us. What do you make and what do you expect from our new monarch in terms of his expressions of concern over the issues affecting the country?
Well, I agree with Simon. It would be bizarre if something that's coming down the track as serious as the cost of living crisis and the winter that we're going to face was something that he felt was out of bounds. I think it has been an absolutely remarkable week, but I'm not convinced that it's a week that shows country coming together. I think it's a suspension, only temporarily and not entirely complete in any case, of the hostilities and the divisions that have really torn the country apart over the past 5-6 years.
And, it does seem, though, that this was maybe a moment of jeopardy, as Simon suggested, and the royal families got through this.
I think it was a moment of jeopardy, and I still think it is a moment of jeopardy. I think what I've found most interesting is that inevitably, for the first few days, attention was focused on the shock and the genuine emotions that many millions of people felt about the passing of a monarch who'd been part of our lives for as long as anyone could remember. But it didn't take that many days for debates about the future, about the role of the monarchy, about the legitimacy of a hereditary system in a democracy, and about the future of the Commonwealth to begin to be part of the coverage and part of the discussion. I think that was suspended for the first few days, but it is interesting that those all now seem to be conversations that are up and running.
So, Lucy, there seems to be a sort of conscious effort to take the kind of love and respect for Queen Elizabeth and almost sort of transfer it into Prince, now King Charles. Do you think that's worked from what you've seen?
Possibly. I think, especially what the Q has done, it's just given us all a bit of levity, and it's been a sort of a moment to celebrate sort of the British affection for the monarchy. Has it changed anything, the coverage this week? I think it's possibly just led people to double down on positions they already had. If you thought that hereditary monarchy was an amazing thing, you probably thought this state spectacle has done us proud. If you think it's a shameful waste of money, you probably feel that your point has been proven.
There's a lot of people in the middle there. I was struck. I went down to the A40 to see whole walks of life, everybody from every different walk of life, kind of on the side of this motorway or near motorway, to see it was really, really quite touching moment. And it strikes me there's a lot of people in the middle who were maybe indifferent, who are warm, should we just say that, if not subscribers to Majesty magazine?
Yeah. I agree. It has been a very remarkable week.
You were sceptical. You're surprised. You sound surprised, Simon.
It's been bloody well organised. Let's face it. The incorporation, the queue. It's like the Paddington Bear scene. The queue has become a feature of the monarchy. And that's been brilliantly done, I have to say. The vox pops, the relentless vox pops, all of which are pro-monarchy, I genuinely think has worked. I think it's brought the country together in a sense in which I really wouldn't have imagined 5-6 years ago.
So we hear a lot about these culture wars and how politics have sort of gone in that direction. Is this a bit of an antidote to what we've had for 5-6 years? Let's bring in David on that.
Well, I think if you were to look at the social media and the tabloid treatment of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex this week, I think you would say that the culture wars have not been suspended for a second, and that those divisions and those attack lines have been highly visible this week. I think the queue is remarkable. Of course, it shouldn't be unexpected. One of the reasons that it's been well planned is because it was entirely predictable, because there were similar queues at the death of previous monarchies. So this is something that's not unexpected. It's just unfamiliar to us because we've had a monarch who's been on the throne for 70 years.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen astonishing scenes this week. I've seen older ladies literally sprinting down the South Bank to keep their space in this queue, Waitrose bags flapping. I've seen, people sort of treating this like a marathon, refueling with coffee and just absolutely determined, no matter how long it was going to take, they were determined to be part of this. And I think a lot of people are just enjoying the spectacle of it. There'll be lots of time for reflection later, and I think when everyone sort of wakes up on Tuesday morning and think, how much appetite will there be for a coronation after all of this?
So, I mean, notwithstanding what David said about some of the treatment in the press of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, there's been a spirit of reconciliation from King Charles from his first speech. The strikes were called off, albeit temporarily. You've got nice, lovely words coming from the Elysee about Queen Elizabeth. Do you think that can change anything?
No, we don't overdo monarchy. This is monarchy's greatest moment. It really has been. And certainly in my life, it's its greatest moment. I think in a month's time we'll be back to normal. But I think we will remember the week as being quite remarkable in British history. It was a coming together, and I agree with David. I mean, there are bits of grit in the mill. Good heavens, it's amazing there wasn't more grit in the mill of the monarchy at the moment. But nonetheless, it's been a coming together, and that in itself, for any nation, a nation as disunited as Britain really is. I mean, Britain is supposed to be a united nation. It's still an unstable union, given Scotland and others.
Well, you used to help Prince Charles write speeches a long time ago. I mean, I'm intrigued. So the comments that we think happened on the cost of living, uncontroversial, but obviously has strong opinions on the environment. That's a contestable issue right now in politics. We know the government sort of reviewing net zero, for example. I'm intrigued to think, hypothetically, if a government abandoned its commitment to net zero, he's totally committed to these sorts of ideals. What do you think he would do? What do you think King Charles would do?
I'd love to be a fly on the wall of a meeting between him and Liz Truss, which is going to take place every week. God help them both. If that is the situation, he's got very strong views. Yes. I mean, we all know that. Yeah. He has abjured it. He's said, I am now the constitutional monarch. I do not have, in any sense, influence over policy. And that's the case. He is a human being as well. He's in daily contact with people in power, but he has no power himself. So I don't see anything wrong with him expressing concern. He's a human being. And I think it's going to be very interesting. It'll be a different monarch from the past one. You won't have this constant aloofness, the obscurity of who is the Queen really. You'll have a king with personal views. And I think politicians will be prying into them. I really do.
David, you mentioned the Commonwealth. I mean, if some Commonwealth nations choose to go their own way and become republics, seems to be factored into expectations. It doesn't seem to provoke a big crisis. It may just be the natural way of things. And King Charles seems to almost expect it.
I think he's been very clear about that, and I think he's been very wise to be so. That is moving in that direction. 2 Commonwealth countries are obliged to hold referendum about the new monarch becoming head of state. The Bahamas this week have announced that they're going to do exactly the same. I think the issue of the Commonwealth is only part of the issue. It's actually the empire that is the issue, because the passing of the Queen coincides with a global reassessment of the British Empire and other empires about their legacy, the legacy of racial thinking, the legacy of inequality that they left behind. And that debate, as I said, was suspended for the first few days in that moment of shock and grief, but it has entered these discussions. So the future of the Commonwealth is wrapped up with the history of the empire.
Well, that's very interesting. Thanks very much for joining us, David Olusoga, Sir Simon Jenkins and Lucy Bannerman there from The Times. Let's take a look at some of the front pages. The Times, you can see there that story, King fears over rising cost of living, and Silence Speak Volumes there, Quentin Lett's sketch of that Vigil of the Princes. The Daily Mail, Vigil for Mama, that same extraordinary sight. And in the FT there, pound hits 37-year low against the dollar, some of the sort of reality outside this all the pomp and ceremony that we're seeing. And that is all from us for tonight. Victoria's back on Tuesday. Do stick with our colleagues across the BBC for coverage of the state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II on Monday. For now, let us leave you with the live images from Westminster Hall, with the British public queuing around the clock, even at this hour, to pay their respects. Good night.